everyone. I'm Damien Edwards. I'm a program manager or product manager, product architect. Our titles have changed a little bit on the .NET team. And I'm going to talk to you in this session about file-based apps. So file-based apps is something that the .NET 10 team has been working on this year. You can think of it as kind of a feature of C# 14, but more realistically a feature of the .NET CLI itself. You saw us maybe talk about this briefly in the keynote yesterday, but today I'm going to try and cover as much as I possibly can about file-based apps. I've got a long list of things here that I want to try and touch on. I'm just going to work through it as best as I possibly can. But before we get into code, let's just first of all talk about why file-based apps. Why have we done this? So running C# directly from a file isn't necessarily new in .NET 10. There have been numerous ways and efforts in the past, both from Microsoft and from the wider community, to enable running C# in contexts that are separate than a project. You may have heard of C# Interactive, which is used by platforms like try.net and the support for C# notebooks, which uses a dialect of C# that isn't exactly the same as the C# inside your regular .NET projects. It might look syntactically the same, but it is semantically different. And so there's also, as I mentioned, kind of community efforts like CS Script and .NET Scripting, and that give you this ability to run C# as a scripting language with just having a C# file. But again, most of those, if not all of them, are built on top of this dialect of C# called C# Interactive. The particular thing we were trying to solve this year was around how can we make .NET simpler for people who are just getting started. And we've been on this journey for a few years now about removing boilerplate from the language where it isn't needed, removing boilerplate from project files when we had project files, obviously, and just trying to make it easier to onboard onto C# and .NET. And this is the next natural step. So our primary kind of person in mind when we build this feature is very much those new users or people who know C# but are doing very simple things. They don't need the complexities that necessarily come with a project. The second type of person that we have in mind is very much sort of scripters and util builders and people building local tools. And so you may have scripts today in your repo, maybe they're PowerShell scripts, they're shell scripts like bash scripts, and you may use those as ancillary utilities to your actual applications to perform various operations on your source code or as part of the developer experience locally. We wanted to target those people and make it possible for those people to write those types of things in C# directly. Just have a C# file and run them using the .NET CLI. And so we have both of those types of person in mind, or both of those scenarios in mind. Sometimes those scenarios do conflict and we have to make design decisions or trade-offs that favor one versus the other. But so far, we're pretty happy with where it's landed, and this isn't the end. This is the beginning. .NET 10 is the first version of file-based apps, and we are planning on improving it continually as we move forward. So with that, let's go and write our first file-based app. So I have got here, I'm just in a terminal. I've got a folder with a global JSON, and my global JSON is just saying, hey, I'm using .NET 10. So we're just making sure that that's the case. I'm going to open a new instance of Visual Studio Code. And the first thing I want to make sure that you understand is that to get the IntelliSense experience and the sort of editor experience for this, you're going to want at least the C# extension installed for Visual Studio Code, but also C# DevKit, which gives you that next layer of the C# experience. And then on top of that, you want to go into your preferences and into settings. And if you just search for file-based, you'll see that there is a section here under .NET projects that says enable file-based programs, which is still in preview, and you need to tick that. So that comes unticked by default in the stable channels. If you're using the pre-release channel of the C# extension, or you're using VS Code Insiders and using the C# extension in pre-release, and this should be enabled by default. And we're currently working really hard just to resolve the last couple of issues to get this enabled by default in the stable channel. But once you've turned this on in stable, then you'll be able to go ahead and start using it. So I'm going to create my first file-based app here. It is simply hello.cs. All I need to do is create a C# file. It really is as simple as that. We'll do the classic kind of my first application thing. So I'll do console.writeline hello world, and Copilot autocomplete is doing a great job of helping me along there. And now I have a file-based app, but it's not really a file-based app until you execute it. What ultimately defines a file-based app is the way that you execute the application. So I'm going to go back to my console now, and now I can just say .NET run hello.cs. And after a brief pause, because my machine's cold, because I've been sitting in this room waiting for my talk to start, now you can see that it's actually executed my app and it says hello world here. If I immediately execute that again, you'll see it's much faster. So I've got a little timer enabled on my prompt here, which I hope you can see. And that first time it ran, it took about 3.3 seconds. And that's because the C# compiler was cold, the C# compiler server wasn't already running. And so it had to start those things up. And there's a cost with that, but they are now running in the background. So then when I run this application again, it's much quicker to run. Now I can continue to make code changes here. So I can go and say .NET conf over here, come back and run that again. And we'll see that it still only takes, hundreds of milliseconds to run. It's not the typical sort of project run time that you might be experiencing with .NET Run if you're using a traditional C# project, where the fastest you can ever kind of get that down to is about a second. With here, we're actually doing some tricky things behind the scenes, which we might talk a little bit about later, to kind of speed up this inner loop experience here. So that's my first application, but of course I can do other things in here. It's not just a single line. I can use the implicit args environment, the args variable that comes from the C# top level statements feature, which we introduced a few versions back. And I'll say, hey, my message is going to be equal to args.first or default. And if it's not there, I'll just call it hello world, and then I will you can go ahead and print that instead. So now if I run .NET hello, we should see the exact same thing. But if I say .NET run hello and I pass it an argument, and I say, hey, I want to say hello, and we'll pass it quoted because we're passing it through as a single argument, .NET conf. Now we're going to see it's doing hello.NET conf. So it's the same C# that you should be used to. It's just that now we're in this kind of new app modality, or this new execution modality. Okay, so what if I've grown beyond the APIs that are available to me in .NET, right? Obviously, I'm running on top of .NET 10, so I have access to everything available to me in the .NET 10 shared framework inside here. But sometimes you need to use things that aren't in .NET 10 by itself. Well, I can bring in packages directly in this file. I don't need to create another file to reference a package. I can do it directly at the top of this file right here. In fact, if I go over to NuGet.org, you'll see that I've got the page for Humanizer up here, which is a fairly popular NuGet package for creating sort of human-friendly strings from otherwise potentially unfriendly pieces of data. And you'll see here that there's actually, I can install this using .NET add package and pass a bunch of variables in the command line. But there's also a file-based apps tab here now, and it tells me that, oh, I can actually go ahead and get this referenced in my file-based app by just copying this line over here. We'll minimize that. And then we'll come over, minimize that, and then bring it straight back. That was clever. And then I can put that up over here. So then if I hit save in here, what we'll see now is the tooling will go out and restore that package for me. And now I should have available to me in the editor, which I do indeed, the Humanizer namespace. And then I could go ahead and start using the Humanizer features here. And Copilot is, again, helping me very much. What if I was just to start doing something like, let's just change this to a new or time span. We'll do timespan.from days, and we'll do 2, and then we say humanize. What is that going to do? We'll come over here. We won't pass that anymore because we're not using it. And now you'll see that you saw the word csproj come up there when I ran that. And that's because I've added a package from the last time that I executed this application. The .NET CLI detected that. It actually is keeping a behind-the-scenes cache. And then it realized it had to do a full MS build. And then it was able to go ahead and complete the compilation, execute the application. So it took a little bit longer that time. But once again, if I just go ahead and execute that again, we're back to doing this in like a couple hundred milliseconds. And again, I can start making changes. So if I make this 10 days instead of 2, and then I execute that again, it didn't do the full MS build again. It simply just re-invoked the C# compilation because the only thing that changed was C#. And I'm able to get this much nicer, tighter inner loop if I'm working with the command line and a code editor, which is kind of the target primary scenario that we're focusing on for this type of application, which is file-based apps. Okay. So what else can we do? This is obviously, you may have seen this before, this is kind of most of what we've been able to show so far with file-based apps this year, but we've got a little bit more time today, so I can hopefully show a few more things. Now my list is quite long, so I'm just gonna go down through this list and start showing things and hopefully sort of fill up your knowledge about what's going on here. First thing I wanna call out is I've been typing .NET Run, But you don't actually have to say .NET Run. You can actually just do .NET hello.cs. Okay, so that's the exact same thing as running .NET Run. Practically, there's a few little caveats. But that is handy for the next thing I'm going to show you, which is the ability to do Unix shell script invocation. So I've got an Ubuntu instance running over here. And inside of here, I've cloned a repo that I'll point you to it a little bit later, which is kind of my playground for file-based apps. And we've got lots of different things in here. But I have a hello.cs file in here. And if I just print that out, you'll see that it looks very similar to what I just wrote before, but it's got this weird line at the front. Now, we call this either a shebang or a hashbang. And that's that hash symbol followed by the exclamation mark. And then it's got a path to some executable. And then typically a single argument that you can pass to that. Now, some shells do support passing multiple arguments, but for safety's sake and for sort of universal compatibility, the recommendation is usually to only pass a single argument to whatever executable you're pointing at here. So what does that enable me to do? Well, on Unix and Mac OS, I can now directly execute this file as long as it's been marked executable. And so if I do an ls-l on my hello.cs, I've actually put the L in there, that would help. You'll see that there's an X at the end of the bits here, the flags, to say that this has been marked executable. And if I wanted to do that again, I could run a chmod with a +X on there on hello.cs, and that's what marks this file as directly executable. So now I can literally just run hello.cs, and it runs. There it is, hello.world. And the way that's working is the shell environment here, which is bash, is reading the first 2 bytes of the file. It's seeing that it is hash and then an exclamation point, and then it is saying, it's marked as executable. It has a hashbang at the beginning of it. I can use that to figure out how to execute this file in this case. And so by supporting this at the top of the file now, we can have these scripts effectively that are directly executable. There are scenarios where you may not even want the extension, and this was all based on feedback that we got from Linux users as we were building this feature. So if I copy my hello.cs to just a plain hello file, and then I look at this now, you can see I've got a hello.cs and I've got a hello file. Now the green highlighting here indicates that they have been marked as executable. So you can see for each green file here, they have that X bit set. I can actually now directly just run hello, like it were any other executable file, and it runs. So we did the work in the .NET CLI to even support running .NET some file name where it isn't .cs. And as long as the first line of that file is a hashbang or a shebang, then we will pass it along to .NET Run app.cs experience and treat it like a C# file. This is useful because some people like to set up their shell environment so that they have a bunch of utilities that they've written that they keep the .cs on, and then they create semantic links to those files in a folder that is perhaps on their path, say like a bin tools folder or something like that. And so they can just drop a CS file in their source code directory. They can edit it with their editor of choice, and because it's .cs, they get all the syntax highlighting and all the rest of it. But they can also then symlink that or semantically link it to a folder that's on their path, remove the .cs from the end of that file in the symlink, and then that means anywhere on their system inside the shell, they can just run the name of that file directly by typing that file name out, which is pretty cool. So we have full support for that as well. Okay. I showed you bringing in packages. Now, debugging with VS Code. This is something that didn't work for a while during the previews, but I'm happy to say that debugging works now. So if I'm inside VS Code, I can very simply put a breakpoint like I could anywhere, and then I can use one of the 17 different ways to start debugging in Visual Studio Code to get that to go. So I'm just going to hit F5, and it says, yes, do you want to do C#? I'm going to do that. And then we'll let it do its thing. It says, debug active file-based app. So it has detected that there are no projects active in the workspace. And so I've only got one C# debugging option, which is please debug this file-based app that's currently active. If I did have C# projects as well as file-based apps in this workspace, then I would get the option, obviously, to either choose one of the projects to launch or to choose one of the files. And as you can see here now, I've got the full VS Code debugging experience working directly in this workspace that just has this single hello.cs file, which I think is pretty cool. So that is there, that is supported as long, again, as you have turned on support for file-based apps in the C# extension using that setting that I showed you a little bit earlier. Okay. So other things that you can do inside here, we've seen bringing in packages using these # directives. Now the official name for these is actually called an ignored directive. So the only C# language or C# language specification change that we made to enable this experience was allowing C# to recognize that if there is a line that starts with a hash and a colon, it should ignore everything after that line. So that's technically called an ignore directive. And the purpose of that is so that higher level experiences that ultimately use the C# compiler, like .NET Run, can interpret or pre-process this file in order to do, create semantic meaning from these hash colon directives. And so we have a bunch of these built into the box. So you've seen hash colon package. You can also do hash colon property. Now what hash colon property will do is allow you to set build properties. So these are things that you would traditionally set in your .csproj file, or maybe through some imported file, like a props file, but you can also do that directly in here. So if I wanted to, for some reason, target .NET 7 or .NET 8 in here, I could set the target framework property. If I wanted to change the lang version, maybe I want to use some new feature that's only in preview, I could set lang version equal to preview here. Any MS build property that you can set traditionally in a project file, you can set using this syntax directly here, which is kind of nice as well. What other things do we have in here? So let's have a little look at what's going on behind the scenes. I'm just going to get rid of what I typed here. Now we can see that there are no assets. Like typically when you run or build a .NET project in the past, you would see an obj folder get created here, and you would see a bin folder get created here, which would have the build output. Now that is still happening somewhere. And this speaks back to what I said before about file-based apps using the same semantic C#. We're still calling the same C# compiler. This is still being built, and it is creating output, which we are then running, rather than this being interpreted. And that's a very key difference, because interpretation changes the semantics of the C#. It actually executes differently. What we wanted this C# to be the exact same C# that you would get if you were in a traditional C# project. So what is going on? So let's kind of like start peeking into what's going on behind the scenes here. If I wanted to find this out without reading some docs, I might start doing some things like this. I would print out, for example, the location of various things that are happening that you might know about as a .NET developer. So I would say like current directory is equal to, and yep, I'll do that, current directory, thanks very much, Copilot. And then I might put another line in here for something like, we'll do app context. We'll just call it base directory, actually. We'll do base directory, which is a .NET thing. So yep, app context.base directory. So let's like see where these things are taking place. If I go back and I run this again, so we'll do .NET hello.cs. So what do we get? So it's telling me that my current directory is where I am, so that makes sense. But my base directory is this long path that's like outside of where I am. C users, my username, app data, local temp, .NET, run file, hello, some huge long hash looking thing, and then bin debug. So if I grab that and I go into Explorer and I have a look inside here, sure enough, we can see the output of this being built. And if I go back up a few folders, here's my bin folder. Here's my, okay, so there's my object folder that I may have been used to seeing if I was using a project. And then we've got this hello folder that it's inside of. And its hello is, you may have guessed the name of my application, hello.cs. And then we've got this long hash that's after that. Now that is derived from the file path. So you basically get a location inside this special temp folder inside of your user profile that we use to store assets and cache information to try and build up and make this experience as quick as we possibly can for the dev inner loop. So yes, it's hidden by default, but it is all just in another location. Okay, this is normal C#. It's just that the project file doesn't exist. In fact, there's no project file here. You may have been expecting that we were generating a project file and putting it in here. Well, we do in fact generate a project file behind the scenes, but it is a virtual project file. It stays in memory. And we actually invoke MSBuild and say, hey, please build this project file, but we just give it basically a project object rather than an actual file on disk. Well, what about if I wanted to get the location of the file? So it's typical in a script. You might execute the script and then you want to do things relative to where the script is located. How would I get that information? So you can do that in here by, you can use something called the app context. So I'm going to do, put another line in here, which is like file path. And for this one, we're going to do app context dot get data, and then we're going to pass entry point file path, which is basically get data. It allows you to get arbitrary data from a bag, like a dictionary of information. And this usually contains various bits of information that the .NET runtime uses and is set by like the build system and the launching system and things like that. So if I go over and run this again, we'll see that indeed I now have the path to my actual file, my hello.cs file. So now that I've got the file that is currently executing, because there's no assembly, if I got the path of the assembly that was executing here, you might think, oh, I could do assembly.get entry point assembly or something like that. That's going to put me somewhere inside this bin debug folder, not the source file that I may want to do stuff relative to. So that's just a little trick on how you can get access to where that path is. Okay, you can also use call a file path to do that, which is a new thing in C#, and it's a somewhat new thing, but we've made these entry point file path data available to you off the app context get data method as well. All right, so you can also reference projects. I'm going to flip over to a slightly more complicated set of examples now. So I have a repo, which has a whole bunch of stuff in it. And it's up on my GitHub account at damienedwards/run file, and I'll share the path, I'll share the URL to that in just a moment. And if I go into this folder called flat, this folder called flat contains a whole bunch of different applications. So you may have realized by now that so far all of these have been single CS files, and that is a current limitation with the current incantation of file-based apps. In this first version, your file-based app is always, by default, one CS file. There's no mechanism for referencing other CS files directly from that one file. It is just a single file. But you can bring in packages like we saw before, and you can reference projects. So over here, I've got a folder called classlib project, okay? And so this might represent a repo that you have. Maybe you own a NuGet package and it's called classlib and you publish that. And so this would be your project file here. And then in here, my class library has a greeter class with a single greet method. But wouldn't it be nice if from file-based apps in the same repo, I could reference this project so I could have like separate samples and they would be directly invocable. I don't have to have a project file for each of these very simple samples. I just have one CS file and they could live next to each other. So I can do that. Here's my hello.cs file. You can see at the top here that it is referencing the project just through a relative path, /classlib/classlib.csproj. And now you can see that that classlib class with its greeter method is available to me because we will traverse that project graph. You don't even have to put the CS project in. You can actually just go directly to the directory, and then we will be smart enough to figure out that that directory contains a CS proj, and we will assume that you wanted us to reference that CS proj. So that's kind of nice as well. So yes, you can reference projects from file-based apps, and the scenario for doing that we got feedback about was typically this one here, where I've got a project already and I want to have lots of different file-based apps that reference it in order to showcase different usage scenarios. All right, in the last few minutes here, what are the real things I wanted to show you? Oh, yes, so we also made some changes. What if I want to do things that aren't just like console apps? So here's an example of a web API that has been written using file-based apps. And we've made a few changes, tweaks around the place to make this kind of more ergonomic. So you might see that over in my file explorer, I have a web API.cs, that's my app. And then underneath that, because I've got file nesting enabled in the Explorer in VS Code, I have a web API.run.json and a web API.settings.json. Now in projects today, you might be used to seeing a properties folder that has a launch settings.json file in it, which contains your launch profiles. Well, we now also support this alternate file name, which is your application name, web API, .run to map to the .NET run command, .json. So this is your launch profiles file, web API.run.json. It can live right next to your file-based application. And then similarly, you might be used to appsettings.json, which is used to hold configuration settings that you read at runtime from your application. Well, we have a new naming format for that as well. You can do application name, web API in this case, .settings.json, and this is equivalent to appsettings.json in the project world. If you want an environment-specific settings file, you can do that as well, web API.settings.environment name, so .development or .production.json, and that will get read by default by the default host as well. So here is my simple web API. I can run this as well. So if I go back to my terminal, and I go into this folder here, this is the folder that I was just showing you. Here are my three files. So I can do .NET web API.cs as I lose my voice. And then now my web API is running. You can see it's picked up the port from my launch profile that's in my run.json file. And if I click that, we can see that my application is running. Okay, so I can do more than just really basic console applications or scripts here. You can start building up other applications by using some of these features. And then lastly, in order to do that, the other thing that I didn't talk about was this #SDK property up here. So you can use SDKs other than the default Microsoft Net Core App or Net Default SDK. So here I'm bringing in the Microsoft Net SDK.web SDK, which enables all the ASP.NET Core web isms inside the application. And then I'm going ahead and writing my top-level statements, minimal API, minimal hosting ASP.NET Core application, kind of as usual, and that works directly there. So lastly, a couple of other things to quickly let you know. You can run .NET Build Web API directly. If you just want to build it and check that it builds without actually running it, you can do that. You can do .NET Restore Web API.cs, just like you would a .NET Restore in a project directory, and that works as well. And you can do things like .NET Clean Web API.cs, which, as you can imagine, also cleans that. So there's lots more I could show you, but I'm now out of time. I can't wait to record more content about this, but thanks for watching, and I'd love to hear your questions.